All right, take two. Who'd thunk it? As you all know, and as I said earlier, our session this morning is being live streamed. So thanks to the support of the Queensland Water Directorate and also the Queensland Government Department of Health. I'd like to welcome our online attendees. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce Greg Jackson, Director of the Water Unit at Queensland Health, to say a few words as the sponsor of this session.
Thank you, everyone. As a co-regulator of drinking water in Queensland, we were particularly pleased, Queensland Health, to have the opportunity to sponsor Brett Chapman's visit to Queensland and to this conference on the basis that there's so much we can all learn from incidents such as occurred at Havelock North. Most utilities in Queensland, probably in Australia, have quite robust processes for internal debriefs, incident debriefs after something goes wrong or when there's a near miss. But it's much rarer for that information to make its way outside the organisation so that we can all learn from it. What I think the external scrutiny on what happened at Havelock North shows us is that there is a lot that underlies some of these incidents. And while we do know quite a lot about Havelock North now, following the large amount of scrutiny applied, I think we can all learn a lot from hearing what Brett has to say and having it discussed by the distinguished panel members here today. That's all I wanted to say. As to the underlying question of the session, could it happen here? I'll leave that to the audience to decide for themselves. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. But firstly, what I just want to do is a little bit of housekeeping with this one here. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way there. So down at the bottom of this one here, you'll see the menti.com. So if you go to menti.com and enter that code, that'll allow you to type in questions that I'll be able to see, and then I'll be able to ask the panelists. The reason that we're doing that is to allow those people who are watching online to also be able to participate in this as well. Okay, so let's go. Whoop, it's jumped in. So I think that the panel session that we had perhaps could have had a new title, which would be, what should we do to prevent another drinking outbreak in Australia? So in Australia, we expect and we assume that when we turn on the tap that our drinking water is safe at all times. Generally, there's little evidence of disease in the community, except in exceptional circumstances. But does that mean that our drinking water is actually safe? So we've got Brett here today, Brett Chapman from Hastings District Council. He's the manager of the Three Waters. And he's here to help us understand the conditions that lead up to an outbreak. What we hope you take out of it is that without vigilance, it can actually happen, and it can happen to you with your own schemes. We've also got Joe Hutchins from TasWater and Toya Foote from SecWater. Both TasWater and SecWater formed originally from smaller councils, and they inherited assets from those smaller councils. Some of the treatment plants they inherited were exceptional. Some were frankly unsafe. In 2015, there was some pretty adverse media coverage in Tasmania, and that led to the CEO of TasWater stating that they would remove all public health alerts. They did that in a very short period of time. So that took the media response to do those. Joe, as senior water scientist, was pretty key in actually ensuring that those schemes were upgraded to the level that they're at now. SecWater, similarly, they inherited a variety of treatment plants from the SecWater SEQ councils. A number of those were deemed to be unsuitable, and because of the grid, some of those have been decommissioned, others have had significant upgrades within those. So Toya, as the Coordinator of Drinking Water Quality South, she'll describe some of those processes there. The intent of this session was to challenge the status quo. What you think may have worked for years may not be good enough. So let's introduce Brett to work out what happens in the event that something goes wrong. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I certainly want to thank both AWA and Queensland Health for sponsoring me to come and talk to you today about failure. Most often when you come to a conference, you're seeing lots of presentations about all the good things that have been done, and I'm going to be talking about something that's still quite raw, 3 years on, both from a personal perspective, but also from our organisation and our community that were at the heart of this incident. So I'll touch a little bit on some of the detail around Havelock North and the chain of events that happened, and hopefully that will stimulate some questions where we can go into a bit more detail. But there might be some common experiences that I talk about that have been happening in your space. So it really is about learning and making sure that it doesn't happen to you. So just a bit of context. Hastings is on the east coast of the North Island. Our water network, Hastings is the largest urban network, about 23,000 connections. To the southeast, Havelock North is it's called the village. And it's connected by one single pipeline from Hastings, but it has for many years had its own bore supply. We're completely groundwater sourced. It sits beneath the feet of the city, and the supply has never been chlorinated or had any treatment. Havelock North, as I said, solely fed from the Brookvale bores. The contamination event itself was a rain event, so it was contamination was rain derived. It was a reasonable event, about a 1 in 20 year event, and there were sort of 2 rain peaks in that time. 125 millimetres of rain. It's about a 1 in 20 year return period. At the time, we weren't worried about the event and water supply. We were dealing with wastewater overflows and stormwater flooding, as you normally would. Plenty of water in the reservoirs. The other key factor here is that there was snow in the hinterland, and that actually took the power supply out. So we had two brownouts of about 45 minutes, which meant that the underground bores, which had sump pumps in them, sump pumps weren't operating, and the bores weren't running. So heavy rainfall, the land surrounding the bores was full of sheep. Overland flow washed that sheep faeces into the roadside drains right around the bore heads. That contaminated water flowed into the bore heads, but also the Munga stream, which is immediately alongside, was full and overflowing as well. So there were 2 theories. The first popular theory was about the water going down the bore heads. The glands in the bore heads were compromised because there was no power. The thought was they'd just simply filled up, gone down the glands, and there you go. No chlorine treatment or anything like that to deal with that contamination. But we weren't convinced that that was actually the cause. We couldn't discount it. But we suspected that the contamination was more widespread than a single point source like that, particularly because in the days following the event, we were still getting E. coli and Campylobacter in the raw water supply, and the storm event had passed. ESR were called in while we were doing a whole lot of investigations. They walked around the paddocks and collected sheep faeces, and of course we had people who'd presented at hospital, so they did DNA matching of the sheep faeces in terms of what was coming out the people at the other end, and they were able to determine that the primary source of contamination, or 72% of the human infection, had come from paddock 2. So pointer, I think, is that? No, yeah. So paddock 2 is here, and the Mungateri stream and pond runs along here and effectively takes all of the overland flow from that point there. While there was overland flow from these paddocks, the DNA didn't match with what was in the infected people. So we set about trying to discount the theory around the borehead overtopping, and we focused on the Mungateri pond, which we can see here as, go back. Oh, it's about 95 metres from the borehead. We had to flood the pond. We filled it with fluorescein, so beautiful bright green colour, and we also did challenge testing around the boreheads at the same time. So we used rhodamine in that case, and we used a special analyzer to detect the signature. So we replicated the event, filled the pond, turned the bore pumps on at the same flow rate, and within 27 hours we had a very strong signature of fluorescein coming through the supply. The rhodamine, which is this orange one along the bottom, really didn't register at all. So again, there was another strong indicator that it was contamination of the aquifer and not just a simple infrastructure failure. If we had just rolled over and said, oh, it's an infrastructure failure, we'll lift our boreheads, job done, Havelock North would have happened again. So one key message here is don't always assume, or don't just take the simple pathway. You actually need to think about all of the causes that could happen and do whatever you can to discount them. So there was this question, well, why hadn't it happened before? The bores had been there for 35 odd years. Why in 2016 and not before? The Mungateri pond had always been there. And we had now strong scientific evidence that contamination was coming in through the aquifer, and that we didn't have any systems to detect change in the raw water supply. Being a secure groundwater meant that you had to do a modicum of testing. Really, it was kind of like hands off after that. So our drinking water standards and the way that they promoted this secure status was part of the failure. So we effectively had no barriers in place. But getting back to this question, well, what had changed? Because yes, we'd had a rain event, there'd been significant change in the source water, but other things were happening. And so we started looking a bit more closely at information that we already had. So we had a look at aerial photography over time to see what was changing. This is the Mungateri pond area in here. So back in, sort of 2010, before that, you actually couldn't even see the pond. There was just massive amounts of vegetation. Somewhere between there and 2016, a whole lot of the vegetation had been removed. So you can see here, massive amount of trees gone. And this may well have happened over a number of years. So change can happen over a long, long period of time, but it then sets up a recipe for something different to happen. And in our conclusion, which we presented to the Board of Inquiry, that when we filled the pond up, water started running back upstream. We thought, well, that's a bit strange. So we went walking along the invert, and of course what had happened is trees that were growing in the bottom of the stream, the roots had rotted out. It was at a point where the aquitard, the overlying layer, was at its thinnest. As they rotted out, the holes were left there, just waiting for contaminated stormwater to go into them. So, unless you look, you don't actually understand what can happen. And that change can be immediate, but it can be also long-term, the slow creep of change. So where did we fail? Because we thought we knew everything about our groundwater system. We'd had done studies. It was yes, while it was close to a stream, all of the observations that have been done was that the stream was being spring-fed from the aquifer underneath. We'd never seen any reversal of flows. So it must be maintaining some positive head. As well, we thought we had sufficient protection with this confining layer that sat over the top. 5 metres in some areas, but when we started looking a bit closer, it was pretty thin or non-existent in other areas of the source catchment immediately upstream. And we'd had no detections for E. coli, but fact is we were doing a modicum of sampling once a month. Doesn't really tell you a hell of a lot. And we'd never challenged this secure status that we had. It had kind of, I guess it had been grandfathered when the drinking water standards became mandatory, such that we had some evidence around our groundwater. We had monitoring which said that we hadn't had any E. coli, so it was given the status that it didn't deserve. So there was this long-held assertion that because we were immune, there was no need for any treatment or chlorine. We also didn't monitor the source catchment. So when we started looking, we were kind of surprised. Lots of open bores, sheep in and around bores. This is an irrigation bore, which is less than 50 metres away from our drinking water bore. And the day I was there, you know, the sheep were up against the bore, scratching their bums on it and having a good old time. There's a mushroom factory which is about 500 metres away. When we went in there, there was evidence of contaminated water pooled in lots of different places. This was an offal disposal pit that had been in operation for 20 years. With all manner of stuff just thrown into it. And again, you know, not too far away from our bores. So some of the stuff was just on our doorstep. The wastewater receival pond from the tomato mushrooms factory in close proximity as well. And they were expanding their business. This last photograph here is they decided that they'd straighten up the stream that meandered through their property because they wanted to take advantage of the land. So they just set about, they didn't seek a consent. They just got an excavator in there and they took 2.5 metres off the aquitard, the overlying aquitard, and pretty much exposed the aquifer underneath. So just a lack of knowledge and understanding around for everybody about, you know, what was in the catchment and what we should have been protecting. We thought we knew our infrastructure. So here it is, bore number 1, the point of failure for a whole lot of reasons. When we challenge tested it, because, you know, we had a sump pump in there and every time the guys looked, there wasn't any water in there, so things must be fine. When we flooded the drains, water poured in and around the pipe penetrations underneath, which you couldn't see. And of course, when we had a look at the glands, they weren't intact. When you actually looked at them, they looked fine. When you grabbed the cables, you could kind of move the cables, and then when you poured water into the top of them, the water disappeared. So it was taken for granted that, and we had independent verification when people came in and they did borehead protection surveys, but they never actually did physical tests. It was all just observations. Gave you a false sense of security. We did some downbore camera work. There's a nice screen. This is in bore number 1, 35 odd years old. That looks pretty good. When we got to the bottom of the casing, there's a whole lot of tuberculation, corrosion happening, and yeah, the bore wasn't in a particularly good state. The challenge testing that I talked about, we flooded the drains, and that water actually backflowed up a kind of a stormwater drainage system that was in and around the power cabinet. It backflowed from the stormwater, came out the stormwater grate, across to the power cabinet, straight down the power cable, straight into bore number 2. So, you know, a lot of these point failures that they look fine when it's dry, but when you start challenge testing these things, you get really surprised. So you've heard this word complacency, and complacency can mean lots of things to different people, but complacency was at an individual level. Myself, my colleagues, everyone that we worked with, we sat in this complacent environment that we were safe and we were immune. But the community was complacent as well, because we'd been taking water out of the ground for 120 years and there'd never been a contamination event, never been an issue with water. I grew up in the area, and it was something that the community prided itself on, with this wonderful source of water that, you know, there's no treatment or anything, you can drink it straight out of the ground and it's safe. Well, you know, that's changed. Some people still hold on to that perception, but we're certainly operating in a different environment. But what it did mean was that this perception meant that chlorine was not tolerated by the community. So trying to have discussions around keeping water safe, even just with chlorine, weren't even entertained. As you've seen, we had no oversight of source catchment protection. We relied on the regional council, who are the consent authority, to be doing that on our behalf, but we weren't checking with them and they weren't checking with us. We didn't have any event monitoring in place. We didn't feel like we needed to. And yes, we had transgressions, but they were all thought to be in the reticulation. So our focus was in the wrong area. Talked about challenge. If anything you take away from here today, if tomorrow you go and challenge some of your systems, please do that, because you might actually identify problems that you don't think you've got. And we had a New Zealand environment with the drinking water standards that actually set you up to fail, because once you achieved a status, you really didn't have to do a lot to retain that status. So in the end, we were using our community as the canary in the mine, in a totally retrospective environment. And Havelock North was a classic case where we had a rain event. It was days later. We were poisoning the community for 5 days before we actually cottoned on to the fact that it was a water supply. So that's kind of what happened in and around the event and the investigations. And then we found ourselves in a board of inquiry. So 6 months of my life was taken away while we investigated and prepared for the board of inquiry. And if there's one thing I can say to you, you never want to be in that space. When you are sitting in front of a government panel and they are peeling you apart piece by piece, it's not a very pleasant place to be. And my recommendation to all of you is, don't ever find yourself in that position. One of the good things to come out of the Board of Inquiry was the 6 principles of drinking water safety. So I'll just quickly run through these. So you've got a high standard of care, because I can't even read it. Protection of source water is primary. Multiple barriers. Of course, you've heard some of this yesterday with one of the presentations where they talked about the 6 principles. Change always precedes contamination. Suppliers must own the supply and the safety of drinking water, and you have to adopt a preventative approach to drinking water safety. So let's just have a look at this. High standard of care. This is what I call my Gordon Ramsay slide. So you've probably all seen Gordon Ramsay's kitchen nightmares. You know, you go along to your local restaurant, you know, front of house all looks pretty good, sparkling clean, everything like that. You expect the kitchen to be of equal standard. And then, of course, Gordon Ramsay shows us some surprises along the way. So, yeah, I won't look at that photo for too long because I want to heave up. But that's the reality. There is, you think of our customers, our consumers, their expectation is, and it is an expectation that the water that comes out of that tap will always be safe. They don't have to interrogate or find out or anything like that. It's just an expectation. It's a given. That's the standard that they set for us. So source protection, before we didn't really know where our drinking water came from. We knew that it came from somewhere under our feet. We've done a lot of work in terms of source protection zones. So this is the Hastings underground aquifer in relation to the bores. And lo and behold, our city sits right over the top of our drinking water supply. Our biggest single risk is our wastewater network. No surprises there. It is fortunately in a confined part of the aquifer, but kind of like the wasteland, which is the unconfined part of the system, it's where our industrial area is expanding onto. So what we're doing is just by creep, when we talk about change, here we are, our industrial strategy is building contamination within our source protection zone. The other interesting fact is that the old landfill sits right at the top of our aquifer system because it was in a wasteland area and in the day they thought, well, that's the best place to go and put a dump. So Hastings' economy is driven by the water that sits beneath its feet. We grow wine, we grow apples, fruit. We're the fruit bowl of New Zealand. We've got industry that processes all of that food, heavily reliant on the groundwater. And we have a landfill sitting there that if it opens up its belly, the goose that laid the golden egg is gone. So we're starting to have some very serious conversations about what we're going to do with that. Because if we just continue to let it sit there and think it'll be all right, one day it's going to creep up and bite us. Multi-barrier approach. Again, this is environment, so your source catchment, treatment, and moving water from treatment to a household. I think we all understand that. The property boundary one, from the boundary to the tap, is an interesting one. In New Zealand, we have a Building Act regulations, which is administered by council. So you've got council as a water supplier, council also as the administrator of the Building Act regulations, yet we don't join the dots together on that. So we're starting to have some conversations about how we can join the dots to make sure that we don't just stop at the boundary, we're actually engaged in what happens between the boundary and the tap. Institutional responsibility. This is about owning responsibility for safe drinking water. The organisations, your organisations, have to be invested from governance and management right through to the operations. And that's about ensuring you've got the right resources, both in number, skills, competency, and then you've got to have a QA system that sits over the top of that. I know here in Australia, your drinking water guidelines are kind of very much more focused on that process space. In New Zealand, you know, we're kind of, Hastings is at the forefront of that, where we've got now a whole dedicated branch of our business, which is around service assurance and quality and everything like that. So it's extremely important. And I use the word evidence. If you ever do find yourself in a board of inquiry, words don't mean a thing. They mean diddly squat. It's evidence, evidence, evidence. Nothing else matters. So keep gathering the evidence because one day you might need it. That comment around quality and safety, which is just naturally expected by all, declare it in a policy. If you haven't got a drinking water policy, declare it. Our council says safe drinking water is our #1 priority for council. It's at the top of the risk and audit agenda, and it's not going to move from there because of what happened to us. And look, I don't want to say, you know, have a contamination event because it actually galvanises your organisation. I think you can still achieve that without actually having the failures that we did. But don't, whatever you do, don't ever compromise your standards. Safety first. Our drinking water family, we talk about our drinking water family now. Previously, our organisational structure used to just be, you know, the immediate team that was involved in delivering through water services. Now you can see we've got Mayor, Chief Executive, we've got the laboratory, we've got all our service providers, consultants, the contractors. They're all part of our drinking water family. That's the business. Everybody who's engaged in our business has to understand what our mandate is around safe drinking water. And last slide, this is a comment that came from one of the local iwi leaders. What is a taonga? Now, taonga is something that's sacred. You don't dick with. It's a treasure, and it's something that you have to nurture. You've got to look after it because it nourishes people and it provides for good health. People's lives are deeply impacted by what we do. We do our business 24/7, day in, day out. But at the end of it, we poisoned 6,000 people and we contributed to 4 deaths. And those people would probably still be alive today if we hadn't failed in a whole lot of aspects that I've talked about. And people are really important in terms of the people that are in your business because they need to be trained and qualified and know what to do when things go wrong and fix them before they start impacting on public health. We can never become complacent. That doesn't live in our dictionary anymore. And you have to remain vigilant. And I use this, you know, in terms of professional people, when you jump on a plane, you see the pilot walking into the cabin. He looks like the guy on the left, not the guy on the right. Yeah, and you have to remain curious. So go away, be curious about your business and what's happening. And yeah, don't assume anything. Right, that's my story. Thank you.
Thanks. We're getting some questions coming through, so I'm seeing all of those coming within here. These are some photos that I've taken along my experiences over the last 5 years. As you can see in the top right, the bore there, around those, there's points of ingress down into that bore. There's also a drain that allows that bore head to be overtopped in a flood event as well. The middle picture is actually a great artesian bore, so that's a safe water supply. So they thought. And then the last one, that's sort of the reservoir integrity as well. So there's plenty of examples that are out there, and I've got 1,000 other photos that I could show you as well. So there's plenty of those there, so be curious, keep looking for that kind of thing. I'd like to welcome Joe up to the stage. Sorry, lastly, just again, for those who haven't seen those, the menti.com on the bottom, that's how you have to ask the questions. Just log in with that number, and then I'll see the questions coming through.
All right, thanks, Michael. Yeah, so my name's Joe Hutchins, obviously from Taswater. We had quite a long and challenging journey to remove bore water alerts across all of our drinking water systems. Project was called the 24 glasses. It ended up being closer to 30, I think, as quite a few towns got added along the way. Just give you a brief bit of history about Taswater to start with. So prior to 2009, all of the drinking water systems were managed by 29 councils and 3 other water authorities. In 2009, with a bit of influence from the government, it was seen as a good idea for them to amalgamate and let 3 other water authorities manage all different areas of the state. And then in 2013, the same thing happened again and Taswater was formed. That map on the right there gives a bit of an idea of just how spread out all of our drinking water systems are across the state. You probably can't read them, but all those little blue dots are all the drinking water systems. So we've got 61 systems now across the state. There's a few other numbers there, about 210,000 connections, 6,500 kilometres of mains, and a lot of reservoirs, storage reservoirs across the state. I'll run through the challenges with what ended up putting all these towns on bore water alerts. So that started back prior to 2009. Quite a few towns were already on bore water alerts. And then a few more went on when Ben Lomond, Cradle and Southern Water took over. And then when Taswater took over, they put even more on. So the challenges were that we inherited assets in a range of conditions. As Michael mentioned earlier, some of them were in really good shape, been operated very well, others were terrible. And what made the situation more challenging is some of the towns their water quality fluctuated significantly. So to be very good, they'd have quite a protected catchment. Then we get a heavy rain event and turbidity would go through the roof. We'd start getting E. coli detections. And so we're regularly putting towns on bore water alerts. And in the end, we didn't even wait for E. coli detections. As soon as we got turbidity spikes, we'd put the towns on bore water. So some of these were chlorine disinfection only. So as soon as we got any turbidity, the chlorine was essentially ineffective anyway. And obviously if there was any protozoa risk, it didn't provide any benefit. So when we inherited all of these drinking water systems, there was also a lack of knowledge of the catchments. There'd been some work done to assess the risks in the catchments, but generally there was little knowledge of this. And further, most plants had insufficient treatment barriers for the catchment risks. So all of this amounted to a great deal of pressure from the Department of Health, and also customers were constantly in the media, the state government as well, to lift all of these bore water alerts. So it was quite a lengthy process in the early stages, just trying to figure out what we were going to do. We had so many systems that were on bore water alerts. They all had a range of challenges. So a multi-criteria analysis, which was quite an elaborate process, was undertaken. So that looked at a range of factors such as the community support. Did the community actually want upgrades? Because this was probably going to lead to an increase in price in their water bills. That wasn't always supported by customers. Were there going to be health outcomes? That was generally a positive. At the time, obviously a huge reputational impact for TasWater. The financial impact on the customers I just touched on. And also there was an indirect impact on customers, which is generally their property prices would increase somewhat, particularly if they were on a main tourist route or as a town where growth was expected. We also had, was there support from the regulator for these towns? Some of them were quite small. So a lot of them were less than 100 connections. So there were times where it didn't actually financially stack up. And it was also going to have a significant financial impact on TasWater. Other areas of the business, it'll impact budgets across the business. So these towns here in stage one, these ones were kind of no-brainers. They were bigger towns in Tasmania, generally more than 100 connections. The cost for the upgrades is normally approximately less than $20,000 per connection, which wasn't seen as unreasonable. Most of them were seeing growth already. A lot of them are tourist towns. But then, so they were all done. Then the chairman at the time came out and said, look, we're going to remove bore water alerts on a further 11 towns. So that was back in 2015, and he gave a deadline, 2016 gave the deadline of August 2018 and said, we're going to remove all of the bore water alerts. So that put a massive amount of pressure on everybody. We had 2 years to build water treatment plants, upgrade systems, get a better understanding of what the catchment risks were. It was a huge undertaking. So that was stage two. And then early into that journey, when everybody was frantic trying to figure out how we're going to do this, he said we're going to remove bore water alerts for every town in Tasmania. So I'll focus now on the stage 2 and 3 there, just because that was the most recent. This came to an end last year. This is what's had the most media coverage in Tasmania. So the options that were put to the table were, if there was a potable drinking water system nearby, perhaps we could connect via pipeline and put reservoirs and rechlorination stations along the way. That was chosen. That was the chosen option for 3 towns, Epping, Colebrook and Judbury. And this came with its challenges as well. For anyone that's been to Tasmania, it's quite geographically diverse and geologically. So a lot of rock to trench and direct drill through. A lot of drilling rigs were broken, which isn't ideal when you've got your publicly committed to a 2-year deadline to remove all the bore water alerts. So drilling rigs were brought down from the mainland to try and help things out. And along with this, there were challenges with power supplies, as a lot of them were remote areas. There was no power nearby, so I had to work with Tas Networks to quickly get power to these areas, which generally wasn't a quick task. Now, so they're the pipeline connections. Along the journey, we also had quite a few illegal connections. So this is before, during and after construction. So this is quite an interesting one. That picture up there was one of our new treated water mains up at Fentonbury, north of Hobart. It had only been in the ground for a couple of weeks. Somebody noticed a leak and the farmer had decided to help himself by live tapping that main. And luckily the town was still on boil water alert at that stage as we hadn't lifted it. Obviously no backflow prevention on that either. And as you can see, did a really good job. And the interesting thing with this is some of these communities, they were so small that people were quite happy to dob in their neighbour that they know that had illegal connections for years. And in one case, it was actually a lady was dobbing in her brother. So, and again, no backflow prevention, so there's significant risk. A lot of these are farming communities with cows and stock troughs, etc., just hooked straight into the drinking water mains. So the other solution that we had was to build new water treatment plants. So 12 plants were built, 7 were modular container type plants that were built off site by Trility. They did a fantastic job there, and they were largely tested in the factory and then delivered on site. So what this actually allowed us to do was do all the civil works on site without trying to worry about commissioning the treatment plant at the same time. And so they could be done at the same time, treatment plant getting sorted, and then just dropped on site and pretty much plugged in, ready to go. So the plants they're all UF membrane plants. They've all got carbon. Some of them have got calcite where it's needed. Three of them have got UV systems as well, where they are category 4, and one of them's a category 3 catchment, where there's high risk. And they've obviously all got chlorine disinfection. They're all SCADA monitored and controlled, so they're all controlled remotely by our operations control centre, and Trility actually they're still running all of their plants for us through a contract. They've all got critical control points which will automatically shut down the plant if, say, filtered water turbidity is too high, or the UV system faults, or there's a chlorine or fluoride issue. So it's obviously there to prevent unsafe drinking water from being delivered to customers. So that's our journey there in a timeline back from when TasWater began in 2013, and the 24 glasses there in 2016 when that was announced, and stage 1 and 2, which are stage 1, 2 and 3 there, which I just spoke about a bit further along. So as I said, it was 24 glasses. A few get added along the way, and there's actually another one that should be on there as well. I think it totals 30 glasses. So what was fundamental for this to happen was early community consultation. Back when we were doing that multi-criteria analysis, we had people out on the ground chatting to customers, doing customer surveys. What that allowed us to do was gain some quantitative data to help in that multi-criteria analysis decision as to what we were going to do with these towns. Thorough planning and preparation. I can't talk about how important that was. Early on, we engaged KBR as to project manage the whole. This is stage 2 and 3. They did a fantastic job. So planning early with Trility and Stornoway, they built the treatment plants, and also Zinfra and quite a few other people that played a big part. And so that leads into the collaboration and open communication. That was really important for it to be a successful project. Right through, if there were any issues, contractors would come to us and vice versa. If we were identifying any water quality issues, we'd let them know, and they were more than happy to try and get to the bottom of it. And the collaborative approach is also really important with our regulator. Taswater have got a really good relationship with the regulator, and very early on we told them what we wanted to do, proposed what our plan was, and they supported that. They told us what they needed from us to make things happen quickly, and that really worked to our advantage and led to us removing all boil water alerts prior to the 2018 deadline. So what's next? So we've removed all of those boil water alerts, but we still realise that we've got a lot of work to do. We've still got systems that are underperforming and present a risk. Not as significant as the regional towns, but they still present some risk. So what I've got here is, so Taswater have adopted the health-based targets approach throughout all of our systems. And what this here shows us is something our water system optimisation team have undertaken. So basically we did all of our sanitary surveys. We know that it's a category 4 system, so it's a high risk. That's got our catchment requirements there for our log reduction values for bacteria, virus and protozoa. That's based on the health-based targets. So they went out and did, our optimisation team went and did assessments of all of the plants to figure out where we had barrier shortfalls, where plants weren't being operated as well as they could, and based on the health-based targets, giving us our log reduction values for each of our barriers. And what that there shows us is that we've got a 2.5 log reduction value shortfall for protozoa. So we know that this plant needs probably a UV system to sort it out. Now, the optimisation team took this a step further and developed this galaxy chart. So what this is, I'll go back one. There we go. So what this is it's a way to visualise what your microbial risk is amongst your drinking water systems. So all of those little dots are all of our drinking water systems. And as you can see, there are far too many in the red there. The red, amber and green are based on the health-based targets water safety continuum, which many of you may have seen. So this is a great way to show management where we need capital and operational expenditure, and as well as seeing ways that we can improve the operation of these systems. So on the bottom there, we've got a log reduction deficit or surplus. And on the y-axis, we've got, based on the good practice guide, a rating score of how well these systems have been operated. So basically that allows us to plot, if we know what our shortfall or surplus is, and we can rate how well the plants have been operated, it can put us on that water safety continuum and show us where we need to improve and where we need to spend money. So going forward, ways to reduce the risk, obviously operational improvements. We've got backwashing, types and dose of coagulant, new and more analyzers for better visibility, and additional barriers. This is a project that's happening right now with, we're looking to install UV systems on plants such as that one that I just showed you where there's a deficit for protozoa. And we're also building a whole heap of new water treatment plants. So in conclusion, we made the decision that all of our systems would be potable. Everybody deserves clean, safe drinking water straight from the tap. As Michael and Brett have mentioned, that's just what people expect. You should turn on the tap and not have to think twice about what you're drinking. And partnerships, super important in achieving our goal. We couldn't have done it without the great work of all of our contractors and brilliant collaboration. Generally, we've had an overwhelming positive response from our customers. Early on, we had a few complaints about chlorine in the system. They weren't used to chlorine or the levels of chlorine that we're dosing, but where we could, we took the chance to educate the customers there, and that generally satisfied them. This has obviously provided some great economic benefits to towns. Probably the biggest one will be Derby in the northeast, which is a mountain bike mecca, and it's gone crazy, especially since they've got clean drinking water. So this was a huge challenge, but overall it was worth it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. So ADWG has often advocated a multi-barrier approach. So we should have been doing this anyway. So since the ADWG was out there. So many treatment suppliers only have one barrier. So challenge your systems, think about that. And the Galaxy chart's a good way of actually mapping those in there. Toya, floor's yours.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, thanks Joe and AWA, and also thanks to Brett as well, because I think everyone would agree here that it's so important that we actually get to unpack these kind of events, and then we get to learn from them, and then we get to take those learnings back to the systems that we operate, and it's for the purpose of us then continuing to working towards preventing something like that from happening going into the future. So I think that's really important, and which then brings us to this question that Michael's asked us to speak to. So can we prevent Australia's Havelock North? Well, the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines actually answers this question for us. So it says that all waterborne disease outbreaks are avoidable. So the answer really is yes. That's the simple answer. The challenging aspect of answering that question is how. How do you actually go about doing that? And that's what Michael's asked SEQ Water to speak about today, is how we went about assessing and managing water quality risk since we formed in 2008. So that's what we'll go through. So the SEQ Water region, so SEQ Water was formed in 2008 in response to the Millennium Drought, which most people have heard probably yesterday a few times. So Linda from DNRME yesterday went through the construction of the grid and how that's all set up. So I won't go through that again, but basically the region stretches from the New South Wales border up to the Sunshine Coast, up to Gympie, and then out west to Toowoomba. When SEQ Water formed in 2008, that resulted in the drinking water assets, or the water treatment plants in that region that were managed previously by 11 councils being transferred to SEQ Water. It also meant the formation of our water supply partners. So I've got there the QU region, our Gold Coast and Redlands and Logan region, and also Unity Water. So they experienced the same handover of assets that we experienced. For them, it was in the distribution systems. So prior to 2008, as Michael just mentioned, the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines were already in existence. So the 2004 revision of those guidelines included this framework for management of drinking water quality. So it was already out there, but it was an opt-in approach. There was no regulatory requirement for water utilities to apply this water quality risk management system. And as a consequence of that, the 11 councils that we inherited assets from, these water treatment plants essentially had limited water quality monitoring data, limited online instrumentation. When SEQ Water formed, it was really virtually going into the unknown in terms of water quality risk profiles. And so I've got there, drinking water in some areas was potentially unsafe, which Michael already mentioned. And what that means is it was pretty evident early on that the likelihood of a sequence of events lining up for a scenario where unsafe water could be produced was pretty high. So the one thing that probably did change also in that reform in 2008 was some councils actually had that catchment to tap coverage. For example, I've just got Gold Coast Water there. So when the restructure occurred, that became fragmented for some of us, and there's been various reforms along the way. And I think, I can say, and I hope the water supply partners would agree, that we are improving that catchment to tap relationship and coverage again, but it's had to be rebuilt. So what did we inherit? I'll firstly say that these assets are no longer in operation, but these are some chemical dosing systems that were inherited in 2008. I'm not actually sure what's in that wheelie bin, but it shouldn't be in there, whatever it is. It wasn't around at the time, but this is just one of the photos in this, in a collage of photos that we have. Michael has a heap of photos, so do we. So these are just some of those assets that were handed over in 2008. So when you receive these kind of assets and you're now responsible for managing the likelihood of an outbreak, where do you start? How do you prioritize how you're going to take this on and provide safe drinking water? I'll come back to the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. So it's those 6 principles and the 12 elements of that of the Safe Drinking Water Framework. That's sort of the foundation for how to manage drinking water. And I noticed the 6 principles in the Havelock inquiry are essentially, they're the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines 6 principles. So, it starts at the top, obviously, or when I say start, don't get too hung up on the numbering. It's not that one is more important than the other. They're all equally important, but, sitting over top of the framework is that commitment from the entire organisation to this framework and to the safe, to managing drinking water to ensure that it's safe to drink. So it's in 3 parts, 3 main parts. There's the system analysis and management part, and that's really where I guess you develop that knowledge of your system. So it's assessing your drinking water supply system. So what's your source water risks? What are your treatment barriers? How effective are they? What are your preventative measures for managing hazardous events? What operational procedures and process control do you have in place? So that's things like your water quality targets and limits. Sorry, I'm not talking about enough. And what do you do when you actually hit those triggers? Also developing verification monitoring programs. So is your data confirming your assumptions? Is it telling you what you need to know? Is it, or what's it not telling you? So I'm probably going to focus primarily in this system analysis and management section today, but of course the other elements are equally as important. So when SEQ Water formed, the water quality team at the time really spent a lot of time in this system analysis and management area, and all of these things were happening concurrently. So it was happening pretty quickly, to the point where, one example where only a couple of weeks after forming, the water quality team and members of the operations team were on Bribie Island. There's a water treatment plant there, Warham. That particular plant, when that team arrived to site and took a look around, there was a water treatment plant sourcing from groundwater bores, some conventional treatment processes. Very nearby was a sewage treatment plant, which sent its effluent to an evaporation lagoon. This was a sand lagoon, unlined, and unlined effluent lagoon, bores sourcing for drinking water. It's a recipe for disaster. So I think Michael mentioned that some of these plants we could take offline immediately because we had this grid that could maintain supply. So, that was one of those that got taken offline straight away. So more formally, the regulations that changed for us, we essentially were regulated to and required to have a water safety plan from 2008 onwards. So that water safety plan essentially for us, we have an overarching water safety plan where we document how we meet the elements of the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines. We also document how we meet the HACCP, the requirements of the HACCP standard, quality as well, and also the requirements that are in the Act. So how do you do that? So I should say we have an overarching plan, but this knowledge of system it's really site-based. It really needs to be site-based and site-focused, because that's really where outbreaks happen. They happen at a site level. And so we have a water safety plan essentially for every one of our sites. And that's what I'll sort of talk a bit quickly about today though. So how do you do that? Well, we don't do it in isolation. So we pull together a HACCP team that includes our operators, our operations management, process engineers, our catchment water quality scientists. So they are responsible for the sanitary surveys, for the catchment, for the monitoring programs in the catchment. SCADA techs, we also draw on our maintenance team, and obviously a heap of data, and then feedback from our water supply partners. And that's really where that system analysis and management knowledge of system is consolidated and then documented in these plans. So I'm just going to focus quickly on the risk assessment component of that suite of site-based management plans. So the risk assessment, so this is really where we are agreeing on our assessment of our source water risk, and we're also agreeing and documenting our assessment of how well our barriers are set up to treat for that source water risk. So for us, this is essentially where we make the statement, what's our likelihood of having an outbreak? And it's in two parts. So the raw water risk assessment, as I said, what's your source water risk? What are the barriers in place to manage that risk? If we assume that those barriers are operating well enough or within as they should be, are they sufficient to treat for that source water risk? We then take those barriers and we interrogate those barriers. So we look at what hazardous events can occur at each of those barriers. What preventative measures do we have in place to mitigate those hazardous events? What's our monitoring? What are our critical control points? Are our HACCP limits correct? From there, if we have significant risks, they then generate improvement plan items. So there's just a snapshot of, I guess, the site-based water safety plans that we have. So would all of this have prevented a similar incident from occurring for us? That was the question that was sort of posed for us. And funnily enough, in 2016, we were undertaking a risk assessment review. Must have been a popular year for groundwater contamination issues. So we were undertaking a risk assessment review workshop, which we do every year for all our risk assessments. We bring our HACCP team together. We review our source water risks, we review our treatment barriers, we review how well they're operating. And in this particular workshop, we pulled up our source water E. coli data for this treatment plant. So this is on North Stradbroke Island, Minjerribah, and in the black there is the raw water E. coli results. And so obviously that immediately we saw that, and in hindsight, should have picked it up earlier. As you can see, that was going on for a couple of years. This particular treatment plant, groundwater source, pH stabilisation, chlorine disinfection, fluoridation. There is an iron filter there as well, but not for protozoa removal. So on seeing these raw water E. coli results, that was a red flag for us. We had two treated water E. coli detections early on in 2011 and 2013, just one E. coli for each of those. You know, at the time, I think people just think, oh, there's chlorine, it's an outlier, it's one. The follow-up sample didn't produce a positive result. You know, it's sample contamination, something's happened along the way there. Anyway, so we got to our risk assessment review, saw these raw water E. coli results. That then quickly led to sample taps being installed on all of our bores, which then led to isolating the E. coli to a particular bore, which was being influenced by a septic system from a house nearby, so that we, you know, in hindsight should have, if we had probably really had a good look at our system, you know, we would have assumed that it probably wasn't impacted by a septic, but you know, hindsight makes things very obvious. Anyway, so that on isolating that particular, on identifying that particular bore, that was taken offline, and we were able to operate our system without that bore in terms of maintaining supply. So when I think about what happened in Havelock, you know, and you ask yourself, well, could that happen to us? I think it's really easy for people to turn around and say, well, we have chlorine, so, you know, that couldn't happen to us. But I don't think that's really the point. I think the issue is that your treatment barriers and how those treatment barriers operate need to treat for the source water risk. So I think a really good example of that is probably the North Battleford cryptosporidiosis outbreak. So in that instance, the source water risk changed, and that then resulted in crypto moving through that treatment process. They also had a treatment process failure, but they had chlorine. So again, so that's an example of your source water risk increasing, your treatment barriers, combination of maybe not having enough or those barriers not operating as they should, then leading to an outbreak. So I guess my point there is that chlorine is not always the answer when you're dealing with all microbial risks. So to summarise, for us, for SEQ Water, we've taken the approach to assume that essentially none of our water supplies are zero risk, none are secure. We don't have control over our catchments. So for us, multiple barriers are essential, and the health-based targets framework that Joe was talking about really sets that out clearly now. And I think it's something that can really be applied. So it does also talk about chlorination of all systems, just from a bacterial risk perspective. And of course, we have to think about the distribution system. So I'm yet to see a distribution system that's completely sealed as well. So it's important for that as well. I think we've been saying it all along this morning, know your system, test and verify your assumptions. If you make an assumption, it should be erred on the side of caution rather than on the side of optimism, and seek to try and test those assumptions. As you can see, Brett went to a lot of trouble to test those assumptions. We don't all have, you know, the luxury to test all of our assets, but I think it's probably safer to assume that something could go wrong and therefore to treat for that scenario. Another good tool, just quickly, is the A quality audit. So that is a self-assessment where you can essentially audit yourself against the Australian Drinking Water Guideline framework. Continuous online monitoring, responding to signals, as Joe mentioned, critical control points, automatic interlock, shutting the process down. Change is risk. So anytime there's a change, assume that there could be an issue there that you have to then treat for. And think about those rare catastrophic events. So you can go along for a decade and not have an adverse result. But if you have a look in your catchment and you see that there's a particular industry or a particular source, or maybe you don't even know it's there, I find it's really difficult to try and predict all of the hazardous event scenarios that could potentially happen, what the sequence of events are. It's better, I think, to set yourself up to treat for those worst case scenarios, or at least to monitor for them and to be able to detect them so that you can respond if you don't have the treatment barriers. And we always tell our operators to ask for assistance at any time. And yeah, the Plan, Do, Check, Act, that's set out in the Australian Drinking Water Framework as well. So keep reviewing what you're doing. What are your incidents telling you? How can you apply it to your other sites? Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone for sending in lots of questions within those. So I've got a couple of slides here as well. So this one is a statement that was made by the government in a comparative report about water service providers, saying there's a number of areas across Queensland where surface supply disturbance due to rainfall events occurs each year, and the subsequent treatment of the drinking water supply is unable to adequately treat the water to a suitable standard. My paraphrasing of that is potentially unsafe water is regularly supplied to some customers. So that's trying to take away the regulatory speak within that. So that would be that's my personal interpretation. So look at your catchments, look at things there. Cows do what cows do. They're a risk. Try to identify those risks. Again, down the bottom is the Menti. If you have any other questions that you want to ask, flick those through. I'll try to collate them as they come through. Sorry, Brett, the first one is a bit confronting. With 4 deaths at Havelock North, were any criminal charges made, and if so, against who?
No, there weren't any criminal charges. The Board of Inquiry were in stage 1. We're looking to see if there was potential that somebody had been negligent, but no one ended up in jail because it wasn't one single person. It was a combination of factors, as I talked about. So the environment, the culture that we were living in, actually were the precedents that allowed us to take our eye off the ball. And even from a regulatory point of view, the regulators were basically signing off on everything that we were doing. So there was no one person that was negligent. What I would say is that if the same thing happened today, as happened back in 2016, with the Board of Inquiry and all of their recommendations, the chances for somebody who is negligent or says, well, we didn't do it because we couldn't afford it, they will no longer have protection in that space because the Board of Inquiry has said, these are all of the things that you must do. If an individual is not doing that, then they are putting themselves at jeopardy.
Okay, thank you. This one's probably both to you, and also Toya might be able to answer this one as well. It sounds like chlorination would have prevented the outbreak. Is this true? And if so, can we rely on chlorine disinfection only for groundwater schemes?
You go first.
Okay, so, no, I don't think so. I think, so obviously chlorine will treat for bacteria and virus risk, but if you're, if your source water is potentially impacted by protozoa, and given where bacteria and virus risk comes from, there's probably a pretty strong argument there that you could have a protozoa risk as well. So the chlorine won't treat for protozoa, and you'd be looking at UV in cases where you could have source water risk. Yeah.
In the case of Havelock North, then quite simply, yes, if we'd had chlorine, then the outbreak would have been minimised. Wouldn't have been eliminated because the chlorine probably would have been overwhelmed by the amount of contamination. But it's fair to say that chlorine is not the solution. It is one barrier. If you ignore your source water and everything that can happen to that, then you are vulnerable to all sorts of contamination, not just bacteriological. So chlorine doesn't fix everything, I'm afraid. But yes, if we'd had chlorine, we probably wouldn't have had the sickness that we had.
I've got a couple of questions here that are sort of around cost of provision of services. And so one of the questions, how can regional and remote Queensland communities bear the cost for fit-for-purpose water treatment? Brett, how has the Havelock community reacted, and would they accept water how it was anymore?
But quite simply, the community said, this shall never happen again. You do whatever you have to do and get on and do it. Cost didn't come into the equation. Our drinking water costs back in 2016 was a targeted rate, $275 a year. It's now closer to $650. Community hasn't batted an eyelid. There's been no discussion around costs. We've got a massive upgrade program and we've done a significant amount of work. And as I said, Council's got a policy that says safe drinking water is #1 priority. Community absolutely backs that. I think the issue, because we have a range of small communities. We've got 11 small schemes, and we harmonise the cost across the entire district. Central government in New Zealand is actually looking at potentially subsidising communities in the far north and down the bottom of the South Island, on the basis that wherever you go in the country, you should be able to drink safe water. If that means that the standard has to lift across everyone, then it's got to be what we term an NZ Inc. problem to solve. So costs should be taken out of the equation as much as possible, because wherever we go, if I go to Cairns or up north or anywhere, I want to drink safe water.
And Joe, there's another one that's sort of related to you. It says, with the Taswater commitment to lift all boil water alerts within 2 years, how was it financed and delivered?
So it was, I think early on, Taswater approached the federal government for funding, and that didn't get approved. So it was completely funded internally by Taswater. Obviously, a lot of these small communities, the revenue just from them alone wouldn't have been enough to build these state-of-the-art treatment plants. So I guess in a sense it was probably subsidised by the ratepayers from across the state.
And there's a question here as well that was sort of asking around that regional Queenslander, and that's probably the way that I view that as well, is that I think we need structural reform in the water industry to be able to allow those smaller remote and more regional and remote communities to actually be able to afford safe water. My position would always be that it's drinking water. Fit for purpose is we must be able to drink it, and so it should always be safe. So we need to find a way to fund that. It's probably from the state or from the feds that we need to get that money. So I think that that's our job in the room to actually try and do those there. Would Taswater or Seqwater have been surprised to have an outbreak like Havelock if you operated the schemes you inherited without the actions you took?
I'd say we wouldn't have been surprised, but luckily quite early on, Taswater, I guess, had the courage to put towns on boil water alerts where they saw there was an extreme risk or an elevated risk, purely because we had a lot of good knowledge when we came together. We had a lot of knowledge in the business then, and so we did recognise the risk. Wouldn't have been surprised, but I think luckily we took the proactive approach and placed these towns on boil water alert. And the reason I say took courage is because it's obviously frowned upon in the community. There are a lot of people that said, oh, we didn't have issues with our water when the councils owned it, when really nothing had actually changed. It's just that we identified the risk and had the courage to put them on boil water alert.
Yeah, so I think similar to what Joe just said there, that SEQ Water recognised the risk, even though those plants had been operated by council leading up to being handed over, that likelihood for the potential for an outbreak was very high for some treatment plants. So, you know, it's hard to predict when that will happen, but you can see that the likelihood was high.
Yeah. Brett, since the outbreak, how many sites in New Zealand have there been identified with similar groundwater risks?
Well, it hasn't been, that information hasn't been compiled at a national level, but it's fair to say that there are other similar suppliers with the same sorts of risks. Yes, we have had an outbreak in a small township in the years after Havelock North, which was, it was interesting, it was a people failure. They had systems and processes, but the operators had moved on, retired. So we've got an ageing workforce, as we know, it's a problem for everyone. And the guys that were tasked with looking after that plant were contractors, roading contractors that had no idea about treatment systems, UV or anything. When the treatment system failed, they didn't know what to do and they didn't actually think it was important. So yes, there are similar supplies out there that have similar characteristics to Havelock North.
Yeah. We've got a quick one here that says, can we have that catchment risk against good practice guide whipped up for Queensland, please? So I think
there's a lot of work in there, but I can certainly direct you. There was actually a really good paper written by Steve Westgate and Matt Robertson who came up with the galaxy chart. It was a really good paper that details exactly how they did it. So.
And that was in the last Ozwater, or
yes,
maybe two Ozwaters away.
Yep.
Yeah. So that is actually available if you go looking for that.
I should just point, it's not as, I think, visually impressive as that one. That's an excellent way to illustrate, I think, catchment risk and treatment plant barriers and log shortfalls. So SEQ Water's going through, or has gone through, the same process for a number of plants and is in the process of going through it again. It takes a lot of data to pull together the data required to do the assessment against the performance criteria under health-based targets. So I'm sure TasWater gathered it would have taken a while to get all that data together. Yeah.
Hey, Brett, are there any basic water quality monitoring probes in the groundwater system for Havelock North?
Simple answer to that one is yes. We've invested heavily in technology, online monitoring, so that we can detect changes in source water in real time. So that's been very much a part of our investment package, is to use technology as much as we possibly can to remove the human factor from the equation. But somebody's still got to look at the data. And this is where I still see problems, is that we collect all of this information, but nobody's actually looking for change. So there's still an investment in people. If you're going to collect the information, do something with it, otherwise don't collect it. It's the same thing with improvement plans that come out of water safety plans. If you're not invested in actually doing those improvements, then it's not worth the paper it's written on. You have to act.
There's one here that's potentially to Greg Jackson in Queensland Health. Why aren't positive E. coli detections, specific instances and trends made conspicuous and reported publicly? Maybe Toya's best place to answer that, though.
Thanks, Greg. So the question was, why are E. coli?
Yeah, it's about that. I guess it's about how we publicly reporting our failures so that customers know.
I think the reportable events would be available where people, were it to be requested. But I think when we have an E. coli detection, it doesn't necessarily mean that water is not safe to drink on that initial positive detection. So, you can't really look at that just in isolation. You've got to look at, what's happening around that result. So, was there an actual treatment process failure? In terms of E. coli, what's chlorine residual turbidity? Undertake a follow-up test as well. But if in that moment when you get that initial detection and it does line up with other evidence that there is a concern for the safety of drinking water, then yes, you would have to take action immediately. If there's other evidence to say that there is in fact a problem. If you have a positive E. coli detection and it's low, in the absence of anything else to indicate that there's actually a problem, then we then follow the regulated retest. We do a number of retests and follow that process.
And it is reported in annual reports as well. So the service providers do have to provide an annual report. They do have to discuss some of those incidents. It may not go into the level of detail that I guess that us in the room might want to see to understand what those risks truly are, but there is a publication mechanism in there. There's one to me. Why aren't the case studies that I showed at the front that were in Queensland documented and available? There actually is some stuff available if you go searching for that town name and the incident that was there. So there is some publicly available information about that, about those risks that are there. Brett says, thank you very much for your presentation. Have you thought about using environmental health officers or trade waste officers to undertake the compliance activity to protect the water source?
Yes, we do. in actual fact, our trade waste officers, as part of their inspection regime with industries, we require them to have a stormwater management plan as well. So stormwater is the kind of forgotten third water in this space, but it's key because stormwater is the vehicle that transports contaminants from one place to another. So we kind of recognise, and in a Maori worldview, the three waters are intrinsically interconnected, whereas in our industry we have in some ways separated the connectivity around drinking water and how wastewater and stormwater impact on that. So yes, from a I guess a regulatory point of view, we have inspections in place. We are developing policies to manage the source protection zone a lot better, but as you'll appreciate, there's legislation that covers activities, and it's quite hard to change legislation to actually have more of a focus on drinking water. So, for example, we're now trying to prohibit certain activities in our source catchment. We're trying to claw back some of the the dangerous things that are happening, but that's going to take a lot of time and effort. But again, we have to do it, because if we don't, then something will happen again.
So I realise we're cutting into morning tea time here. I have been given permission to run a few more questions a little bit longer. I've got 5 more minutes here that I'm allowed to go. So if the panellists are still happy, we'll keep going. So there's a couple more catchment type questions within there. And so the first one was, and I'll go through both of them because before I let you answer, Toya. The first one is, have Seqwater considered land procurement to enable a controlled catchment? And the second one that was being asked around there is, can Seqwater catchments be protected and avoid recreational activities within the catchment?
So our catchments are very large. I don't think it's realistic to try to purchase them all. But I think, we do have a source protection team, and they do really great work trying to work with landowners and other catchment organisations to try to, to improve some point sources of contaminants in the catchment. So we probably can't purchase the whole catchment, unfortunately. And then on the question of recreation, obviously from where I sit in the water quality team, that imposes an additional challenge for us for water quality, and so that has. But I guess that's a decision that SEQ Water has made, or perhaps even inherited in some ways. That a lot of our catchments were open to recreation, and then to take that away from people is. It's another, I guess, another service that SEQ Water provides to the community. So for sites that have always had recreation, we then have to then look at our treatment for those sources and whether we can treat for that risk.
Okay, so there's one here that says there's a fair bit on catchment risk, not much on network recontamination risk in general. And that was there was another question in here saying, how safe are water storage tanks from contamination ingress, and what are the strategies for managing those risks? So, anyone really?
Well, I can just, from our experience, when we started looking at our reservoirs, we were very surprised. It's one thing to lift the hatch and shine a torch in there. When you stick a submersible robot in there and you explore every single inch of your reservoirs, you become very surprised. We've also gone through the process of challenge testing our reservoirs. So concrete reservoirs, we flooded all of the roofs with cameras inside, and you can see where all of the leaks are. One reservoir, we found a massive bed of tree roots growing in one corner of the reservoir. So it had just worked its way through one of the cracks. You would never have picked it up by simply lifting the hatch.
All right. I apologise to the 7 other people who had questions that we haven't got to today. I hope that I've tried to cover most of those things within there and most of the themes within there. So please join me in thanking Joe, Toya and Brett.